U.S.-Iran conflict. Could it escalate into a world war? Russia, China, Ukraine involved? The question that haunts strategic analysts around the world is no longer whether this conflict will remain contained, but rather how far the escalation will extend before the limits of great power patience are finally exceeded. What began as an American-Israeli assault on Iran has metastasized in mere days into a regional conflagration that touches the vital interests of Russia, China, and the entire emerging multipolar bloc. The missiles flying between Iran and Israel are not simply weapons of localized destruction. They are signals in a much larger conversation about the future of the global order, and the responses from Moscow and Beijing suggest that the world's great powers understand perfectly what is truly at stake. We stand at a precipice that few in Washington seem to comprehend, a moment when American aggression against Iran could trigger cascading consequences that transform a regional war into something far more catastrophic. Hey everyone, I'm Michael Harris, geopolitical and military analyst, and you're watching my channel. What I'm about to share with you examines the most dangerous dimension of this conflict, the possibility that the war against Iran could expand into a confrontation between the world's major powers with consequences that would reshape human civilization. This is not alarmism, but analysis, a careful examination of the interests, alliances, and dynamics that could transform American aggression against Iran into the spark that ignites a much larger fire. Before we examine how Russia, China, and even the Ukraine conflict connect to what is happening in the Middle East, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Drop a comment with your thoughts as we go through this together, and share this video with everyone who needs to understand why the stakes of this conflict extend far beyond the borders of Iran. Now let's examine how this war could escalate into something the world has not seen since 1945. The strategic partnership between Russia and Iran has transformed dramatically over the past 2 years, evolving from tactical cooperation into something approaching a genuine alliance. In January 2024, Moscow and Tehran signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement that formalized military, economic, and technological cooperation at unprecedented levels. This was not merely diplomatic symbolism. It represented a fundamental realignment of Eurasian power structures in response to what both nations perceive correctly as American aggression against the multipolar world order. Russia has provided Iran with advanced air defense systems, satellite intelligence capabilities, and technical expertise that has significantly enhanced Iranian military capacity. In return, Iran has supplied Russia with the Shahed drones that have proven devastatingly effective against Ukrainian infrastructure and military positions. This relationship creates immediate complications for American war planners. Russia has substantial interests in Iranian survival and success. Moscow cannot afford to see its strategic partner defeated and dismembered by American power, both because of the direct material benefits of the relationship and because Iranian defeat would represent a catastrophic setback for the multipolar project that Russia has championed. President Putin has been notably restrained in his public comments about the conflict, but Russian diplomatic channels have conveyed clearly that Moscow views American attacks on Iran as attacks on Russian strategic interests. The question that haunts Western capitals is simple. At what point does Russian restraint give way to Russian action? The parallels with the Ukraine conflict are instructive and alarming. Russia has demonstrated over the past 3 years its willingness to absorb enormous costs in pursuit of strategic objectives it considers vital. The Western assumption that sanctions and military pressure would cause Russian collapse has proven spectacularly wrong. Moscow has instead adapted, finding new partners, developing new capabilities, and demonstrating a resilience that confounded Western expectations. If Russia was willing to endure such costs over Ukraine, a country that borders Russian territory but does not provide the strategic depth that Iran offers, what might Russia be willing to do to prevent Iranian defeat? The scenario that keeps strategic analysts awake at night involves Russian escalation in response to American attacks on Iran. This could take multiple forms. Russia could dramatically increase military assistance to Iran, providing advanced weapon systems that would significantly complicate American operations. Russia could open new fronts in the Ukraine conflict, forcing the United States to divert resources and attention from the Middle East. Russia could take actions in the cyber domain or against American interests elsewhere that impose costs Washington has not anticipated. Most ominously, Russia could provide Iran with capabilities that cross thresholds the United States has attempted to maintain, fundamentally changing the character of the conflict. China's position is equally significant and perhaps even more consequential for the long-term trajectory of this conflict. Beijing has invested enormously in Iran as a critical node in the Belt and Road Initiative, the grand strategic project through which China is reshaping Eurasian economic geography. Iranian energy resources, Iranian geographic position as a land bridge between Asia and Europe, and Iranian markets all figure prominently in Chinese strategic calculations. The comprehensive strategic partnership that China and Iran signed represents a 25-year commitment involving hundreds of billions of dollars in investment and trade. Chinese interests in Iranian survival are not abstract or ideological. They are concrete, material, and substantial. Moreover, China views American action against Iran through the lens of its own concerns about American intentions toward Chinese interests. If the United States can attack Iran with impunity, destroying a nation's infrastructure and assassinating its leadership because Washington disapproves of its policies, what prevents the United States from taking similar action against Chinese interests when convenient? The precedent being established in Iran has implications for Taiwan, for the South China Sea, for every arena where American and Chinese interests compete. Beijing understands that allowing Iran to be crushed would signal that resistance to American hegemony is futile, a message that would undermine the entire multipolar project that China champions. The Chinese response to the conflict has been measured but unmistakable. Beijing has refused to condemn Iranian actions, has called for restraint from all parties in language that clearly assigns greater responsibility to the American side, and has intensified economic cooperation with Tehran even as American bombs fall on Iranian cities. Chinese diplomats have conveyed through multiple channels that Beijing will not accept Iranian defeat and that American escalation will be met with Chinese countermeasures. The nature of those countermeasures remains deliberately ambiguous, but the possibilities range from economic actions against American interests to more direct forms of support for Iranian resistance. The economic dimensions of potential Chinese involvement are particularly significant. China holds enormous quantities of American debt and could, if sufficiently provoked, take actions in financial markets that would impose severe costs on the American economy. Chinese manufacturing dominance means that American supply chains remain vulnerable to disruption in ways that would be felt immediately by American consumers and businesses. The technological dependencies that have developed over decades of globalization give Beijing leverage that military planners often underestimate. A Chinese decision to weaponize economic relationships in response to American aggression against Iran would not require a single shot to be fired, but could nonetheless inflict damage that would reshape American strategic calculations. The connection to Ukraine adds another layer of complexity to this already dangerous situation. The war in Ukraine has consumed enormous quantities of American and European military resources, depleting stocks of precision munitions, air defense missiles, and other critical supplies. Colonel Douglas Macgregor has noted that American interceptor missile stocks have been significantly reduced by transfers to Ukraine, creating vulnerabilities that Iranian planners have exploited. The United States is attempting to wage two major conflicts simultaneously, supporting Ukraine against Russia while attacking Iran directly, and the strain on American military capacity is becoming increasingly apparent. The strategic community in Washington appears not to have fully grasped the connection between these conflicts. Resources committed to Ukraine are resources unavailable for the Middle East. Attention focused on one theater is attention diverted from another. Most significantly, the adversaries in both conflicts are not isolated actors, but increasingly coordinated partners who share intelligence, provide mutual support, and calibrate their actions to maximize pressure on American capabilities. Russia benefits from American entanglement in the Middle East because it diverts resources from Ukraine. Iran benefits from Russian engagement in Ukraine because it diverts American attention and depletes American stocks. The synergy between these conflicts creates compounding pressures that neither would generate alone. The possibility of deliberate coordination between Russian and Iranian military actions represents perhaps the most dangerous escalation scenario. Imagine a situation where Iranian missile strikes on American positions in the Gulf coincide with Russian offensives in Ukraine, forcing American commanders to make impossible choices about resource allocation. Imagine Russian provision to Iran of advanced air defense systems that suddenly make American air operations dramatically more costly. Imagine Chinese actions in the Taiwan Strait, timed to coincide with moments of maximum American distraction in the Middle East. These scenarios are not fantasies, but contingencies that military planners in Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran have certainly considered and perhaps prepared. The regional dynamics of the current conflict already demonstrate how quickly escalation can spread beyond initial boundaries. Iranian missiles have struck targets in the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. American bases across the region have come under attack. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of global oil exports flow, is effectively contested. Oil prices have spiked dramatically, imposing costs on economies worldwide. The Red Sea has become impassable for commercial shipping, with cascading effects on global supply chains. And this is merely the regional dimension of a conflict that could expand much further. Turkey's position illustrates the complexity of alliance structures that could draw additional parties into an expanding conflict. NATO member Turkey has watched Iranian missiles strike the American base at Incirlik on its territory, and has notably failed to invoke alliance provisions that might obligate other NATO members to respond. Turkish officials have suggested for years that they want American forces out of Incirlik, and the Iranian strikes may provide the pretext for demanding withdrawal. If Turkey moves from passive NATO member to active opponent of American regional policy, the alliance structure that has underpinned Western strategy for 75 years could fracture in ways that would reshape global politics. The domestic political dimensions in multiple countries create additional unpredictability. President Trump launched this war expecting quick victory that would demonstrate American power and provide political benefits at home. The prolonged conflict that has instead developed creates pressures for escalation as political leaders seek the decisive victory that continues to elude them. In Israel, Netanyahu has staked his political survival on achieving objectives that remain out of reach, creating incentives for actions that rational strategic calculation might counsel against. In Iran, the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei has created pressure for responses that demonstrate the nation will not be intimidated regardless of cost. Each of these domestic dynamics pushes toward escalation rather than de-escalation. The nuclear dimension of this conflict demands careful attention. Iran has maintained for years that its nuclear program is purely peaceful, but American and Israeli attacks may be changing that calculation. Why should Iran accept the vulnerability that comes with non-nuclear status when nuclear-armed adversaries feel free to assassinate its leaders and bomb its cities? The attack that was supposed to prevent Iranian nuclear capability may instead be accelerating it, as Iranian leaders conclude that only nuclear deterrence can prevent future aggression. A nuclear-armed Iran would fundamentally transform the strategic equation in the Middle East and create new possibilities for catastrophic escalation. The international legal and institutional framework that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of conflict has proven completely ineffective. The United Nations Security Council is paralyzed by great power division. International law prohibits precisely the kind of aggressive war that the United States has launched, but no mechanism exists to enforce those prohibitions against the world's most powerful military. The rules-based international order that American officials constantly invoke applies, it seems, only to adversaries and never to the United States itself. This hypocrisy is not lost on the global majority, and it accelerates the erosion of American soft power and legitimacy that makes future conflicts more likely. The economic consequences of this conflict extending into a great power confrontation would be catastrophic beyond calculation. Global trade would collapse as shipping becomes impossible in multiple regions simultaneously. Energy prices would spike to levels that would trigger recessions worldwide. Financial markets would experience disruptions that would make 2008 look like a minor correction. Supply chains that have developed over decades would shatter, leaving economies unable to function. The economic integration that has characterized the post-Cold War era would reverse violently, with consequences that would take generations to repair. The human cost of such a conflict defies imagination. The wars of the 20th century killed tens of millions. A great power conflict in the 21st century, with weapons of vastly greater destructive capability and populations of vastly greater size, could produce casualties that would reshape human demographics. The cities that might be destroyed are not abstract points on a map, but homes to millions of human beings whose lives would be ended or shattered. The moral weight of decisions being made in Washington, Tel Aviv, Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing could not be greater. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is the absence of effective communication channels and crisis management mechanisms between the major parties. During the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union developed elaborate systems for signaling intentions, managing escalation, and preventing miscalculation from triggering catastrophe. Those systems do not exist today at comparable levels between the United States and its current adversaries. The fog of war creates opportunities for misunderstanding. Actions taken for one purpose can be interpreted as signals of something else entirely. In an environment of mutual suspicion and incomplete information, escalation can develop momentum that becomes impossible to arrest. The path toward de-escalation would require American recognition that the assault on Iran has failed to achieve its objectives and is instead generating consequences that threaten American interests far more than Iranian capabilities ever did. It would require Israeli acceptance that regional hegemony through military force is not achievable, and that security must be sought through accommodation rather than domination. It would require great power diplomacy that acknowledges the legitimate interests of all parties and seeks solutions that none regard as capitulation. The prospects for such wisdom emerging from current leadership in Washington and Tel Aviv appear, unfortunately, remote. Iran, for its part, has demonstrated both capability and restraint throughout this conflict. The Islamic Republic has responded to aggression with defensive measures proportionate to the attacks it has suffered. It has not sought to expand the conflict, but has made clear that it will not accept defeat. Iranian civilization, which has endured for 2,700 years and survived every empire that attempted to subjugate it, is proving once again that it cannot be destroyed by missiles, no matter how sophisticated. The resilience that has characterized Persian history is manifesting once more in the face of the greatest assault the Islamic Republic has ever experienced. The question of whether this conflict escalates into something larger will ultimately be answered not by analysts, but by decision makers in multiple capitals who face choices of unprecedented consequence. The hope must be that wisdom prevails, that the recognition of catastrophic risk produces the restraint necessary to find paths toward peace. But the dynamics currently in motion provide little basis for optimism. Each day brings new provocations, new casualties, new reasons for grievance that will fuel future conflict. The window for de-escalation narrows with each passing hour. I want to hear your thoughts on the possibility of this conflict expanding into a great power confrontation. Do you believe Russia and China will remain on the sidelines indefinitely? Or will American aggression against their Iranian partner eventually provoke responses that transform this regional war into something far more dangerous? What would it take for wisdom to prevail over the dynamics pushing toward escalation? Drop your comments below. The BRICS dimension of this conflict deserves particular attention because it represents the institutional framework through which the multipolar world is organizing itself. Iran joined BRICS in January 2024, becoming part of an economic and political bloc that now encompasses approximately 40% of global population and a quarter of global GDP. This is not merely a discussion forum, but an alternative architecture for international relations, one that explicitly challenges American hegemony and the dollar-dominated financial system that has underpinned American power for decades. An attack on Iran is, in this context, an attack on BRICS itself, a message that membership in the multipolar bloc provides no protection against American aggression. The other BRICS members are watching this conflict with intense attention to what it reveals about the costs and benefits of alignment with the emerging multipolar order. If Iran is defeated and dismembered, what message does that send to other nations considering alignment with China and Russia? If, on the other hand, Iran survives and demonstrates that American military power has limits, what message does that send about the viability of alternatives to American hegemony? The outcome of this conflict will shape the calculations of dozens of nations currently navigating between the declining American-led order and the emerging multipolar alternative. The financial dimensions of potential escalation extend beyond immediate market disruptions to questions about the fundamental architecture of the global economy. The dollar's status as reserve currency depends ultimately on confidence in American institutions and restraint in American policy. Each act of American aggression, Each weaponization of the financial system for geopolitical purposes, each demonstration that dollar holdings can be frozen or seized at American discretion, erodes that confidence incrementally. The war against Iran accelerates de-dollarization trends that were already underway, as nations conclude that holding reserves in dollars creates unacceptable vulnerability to American pressure. Colonel Douglas McGregor has noted that we could be heading toward a financial crisis worse than 2008, driven by the disruption this conflict is causing to global energy markets and supply chains. The bond market stress he anticipates would not be a temporary fluctuation, but a structural shift reflecting diminished confidence in American financial management. When the world's reserve currency issuer launches aggressive wars that disrupt global trade, rational actors begin seeking alternatives. The acceleration of this process may prove more damaging to American power than any military setback on the battlefield. The information warfare dimensions of this conflict reveal patterns that deserve careful attention. Western media has consistently portrayed the conflict in terms favorable to American and Israeli narratives, emphasizing Iranian aggression while minimizing the unprovoked nature of the American assault. The assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei has been celebrated rather than condemned as the state terrorism it represents. Iranian civilian casualties receive minimal attention, while any Israeli casualties dominate headlines. This propaganda function of Western media is not accidental, but essential to maintaining domestic support for policies that serve elite interests rather than public welfare. The contrast with how the conflict is perceived in the global majority is striking. In Africa, Asia, Latin America, and even significant portions of Europe, the American assault on Iran is seen for what it is: unprovoked aggression by the world's most powerful military against a nation whose primary offense is refusing to submit to American dictates. The double standards are obvious to anyone outside the Western media bubble. International law prohibits aggressive war except when the United States wages it. National sovereignty is sacred except when the United States violates it. Assassination of foreign leaders is terrorism except when American bombs accomplish it. This hypocrisy is not lost on the billions who watch and remember. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about in 1961 has found in this conflict another opportunity for profit. Defense contractors whose stock prices have risen dramatically since the war began have powerful incentives for its continuation and expansion. The weapons being expended must be replaced, and replacement means contracts worth billions. The political contributions and lobbying expenditures of defense corporations create influence in Washington that shapes policy toward outcomes favorable to their interests. The permanent war economy that has characterized American society since World War II finds in the conflict with Iran another chapter in its endless pursuit of profit through violence. The generational dimensions of potential great power conflict deserve consideration. Those making decisions about war and peace today will not bear the consequences of their choices. It is young people, those who will fight and die, those who will inherit the debts and the grievances, those who will live in the world these decisions create, who will pay the price for the hubris of their elders. The disconnect between those who order wars and those who suffer their consequences has characterized human history, but the magnitude of potential catastrophe in the nuclear age makes this disconnect more dangerous than ever before. The historical parallels that analysts invoke are sobering without being deterministic. The years before 1914 saw great powers locked in alliance systems that transformed a regional crisis into a global catastrophe. The years before 1939 saw aggressive powers convinced that their adversaries lacked the will to resist, and that quick victories would reshape the international order in their favor. In both cases, the consequences exceeded anything the decision-makers had anticipated, and millions died because of miscalculations made by a handful of individuals convinced of their own wisdom. We cannot know whether the current moment resembles those precedents, but we cannot ignore the parallels either. The environmental dimensions of potential great power conflict add another layer of catastrophe to consider. The destruction of infrastructure in major wars releases pollutants that affect populations far beyond the battlefield. The use of certain weapons creates contamination that persists for generations. The diversion of resources to military purposes accelerates the neglect of environmental challenges that threaten human civilization on timescales slightly longer than the news cycle considers. And of course, the ultimate environmental catastrophe, nuclear winter following nuclear exchange, would make all other environmental concerns irrelevant by ending civilization itself. What Iran has demonstrated throughout this conflict is that a nation determined to maintain its independence can resist even the combined pressure of the world's most powerful military forces. The missiles continue to fly from Iranian territory despite hundreds of American strikes. The population continues to function despite the assassination of their leader. The military command structure continues to operate despite every American effort to disrupt it. This resilience is not accidental, but the product of decades of preparation for exactly this scenario. Investment in hardened infrastructure, development of indigenous capabilities, cultivation of regional allies, and nurturing of a national will that refuses to submit to foreign domination. The civilization that has endured for 2,700 years, that has survived Alexander, survived the Arab conquest, survived the Mongols, survived colonialism, survived revolution and war, is demonstrating once again that it cannot be destroyed by external force. The Persian genius for adaptation, for survival, for transforming conquest into cultural synthesis, manifests in the Islamic Republic's capacity to absorb blows that would shatter lesser nations. Washington's fundamental error has been to assume that Iran is weak because it is sanctioned, isolated because it is targeted, vulnerable because it is surrounded. In fact, Iran's experience of adversity has created strengths that comfort and complacency never could. The path forward requires recognition in Washington that the war has failed, that Iranian defeat is not achievable at acceptable cost, and that the pursuit of unachievable objectives is producing consequences that damage American interests far more than Iranian capabilities ever threatened. It requires acknowledgement in Tel Aviv that security through domination is not achievable, that the dream of regional hegemony was always a fantasy, and that Israel's future lies in accommodation with its neighbors rather than eternal warfare against them. It requires great power diplomacy that brings Russia and China into negotiations, not as adversaries, but as stakeholders whose interests must be addressed if any settlement is to prove durable. The alternative to such wisdom is escalation without clear limit, toward consequences that could reshape human civilization in ways none of us would choose. The dynamics currently in motion push toward that alternative. Each side believes it cannot be seen to back down. Each side calculates that one more escalation might finally produce the breakthrough that has eluded previous efforts. Each side underestimates the resolve and capability of the other. These are the dynamics that have produced catastrophe throughout human history, and they are manifesting once again in the conflict between the United States and Iran. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Share this video with everyone who needs to understand why the stakes of the conflict in Iran extend far beyond that nation's borders and touch the vital interests of every person on this planet. I'm Michael Harris. The war against Iran is not simply a regional conflict, but a potential trigger for great power confrontation that could reshape human civilization. Russia and China have vital interests in Iranian survival. The connections between the Middle East and Ukraine create compounding pressures on American capabilities. The economic and human costs of escalation are beyond calculation. And the decision makers whose choices will determine whether we step back from the precipice or plunge into the abyss have thus far shown little evidence of the wisdom the moment demands. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and understand that what happens in Tehran, in Tel Aviv, in Moscow, and in Beijing over the coming days and weeks may determine the trajectory of history for generations to come. I'll see you in the next video.